That's probably my first memory of feeling the Spirit. I was 4, and Dad had left me across the railroad tracks, probably 2 miles or so from home. And I was at dancing, and the teachers were from Salt Lake. They left at noon to go home and left me sitting on the front porch, different day and age. And I was waiting for Dad to come with his errands and pick me up, but he forgot. He had a lot of things to do that day. He had one car, and he probably had work things as well as yard things and responsibilities for community and school, as well as the home. And so I waited until about probably 3 or so, and I was watching the sun and thinking, I've got to go home. I was supposed to color eggs with Hoyt, who lived next door, who's my friend, and we were going to color at 4 o'clock, so I felt like I had to be home by 4 o'clock to color those eggs. So I thought, well, I had been once on the way home. I think Mother and I had gone to see Meet Me at St. Louis, the movie, and had walked home. So I knew about how it was, but it was a long way, and there was one place I remember that divided, and I wasn't sure if I'd know which place to take. But I thought about it and remembered that if I prayed about it, I would have a good feeling, and if it wasn't the right way, I would not have a clear feeling, and I would just trace my steps and go back. So I started. Now the big problem was there was a huge lot of railroad tracks, like several banks of railroad tracks. And I didn't know how I'd get across those because there was a man in a little shed who kind of watched the tracks. But he was down at the other side, and there was a family he was talking to, so I skipped over the tracks without him seeing and got on my way. And when I came to that fork, I took one way, and the trees looked funny. I had a strange feeling, and the trees didn't feel right, so I prayed about it and retraced my steps and started the other way. It felt good, and prayed my way home, and came in the house to find that Dwight had colored the eggs with his sister. It was 4 o'clock. It was in time, and he had not waited. So I was heartsick. And in a few minutes, Mother said, "Where's Ellis?" And I said, "I don't know. He never came." She just could not believe I had walked home. But it was a blessing to me because I always knew, and I think now how much my parents had taught me to be able to know how to pray my way home. But I had very, very full confidence that if I prayed the right way, the Lord would help me know what I should do. So it wasn't frightening. And from that point on, I had the blessing of knowing that I could feel the Spirit and pray for guidance and help, which many times I did in lots of different ways.
My earliest memory of her is when she came home from the hospital with my baby sister Jeannie. I must have been about 3 years old. In those days, women stayed in the hospital sometimes a week or longer. She had on a fuchsia velvet-like robe, and I remember looking at her in awe and just feeling no queen could have inspired such worshipful feelings. And that's my first memory.
They were very healthy. I remember Mother being sick once, and she was really sick. She must have had the flu. And the Relief Society sisters, I think it was Sister Mary Jacobs, I'm not sure, came with a can of chicken noodle soup, and we thought it was wonderful. And it was just what we needed, and she was in bed for a day or two, really, really ill, and that's the only time I remember Mother being sick. And
I remember once she was having a party upstairs, and so she fixed a party for us downstairs of hot tuna sandwiches and cocoa, which we ate around our play table in the basement. I remember a spider web and a spider that she made and hung in the corner of our bedroom for Halloween, and a house of sugar cubes put together with red icing that she made for Christmas.
But Mother cried bushels when Aunt Mary Whitehurst died. I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with her? I was 7, and Mother was just beside herself. The phone rang, I guess, and someone called to tell her. And Dad was in Provo. He must have been taking classes for the seminary program. And he'd taken Mary Ann to stay with Grandmother. So they were there, and I was home with Jeannie and Mother. And Mother was apart. In my whole life, I've never seen her quite that apart. She said, "What am I going to do? I've got to go, I've got to go." I said, "Well, go, Mother." So she took the bus. She called the bus station to see if she could get a ticket. She couldn't find the number. She couldn't dial it. So I looked it up and dialed it for her. And she was really a wreck, and and so she called and got a ticket to go, and she asked the neighbor if she would come and watch Jimmy and I at night. So she went for 3 days. She went to Provo, and then Dad took Marianne and Mother on to St. George, and they stayed for the funeral, and Dad came home in 3 days, but Mother stayed for the week. She had been so good and sweet to her. She was like a second mother. So she was very, very lonesome without her. She cried for days. I remember over the dishes at night as she would talk to the neighbor across the driveway or at home. She was teary for a long time when she lost Aunt Mary.
One of my earliest memories is when I was bedridden for a month with symptoms of rheumatic fever. My legs would ache, and he would rub my skinny little legs in his big, strong hands. I remember when I was sick, my mother brushing and braiding my hair and putting clean sheets on my bed.
So, what I wanted to talk about was the fact that Marcelly and Marianne were off at school, and I was only 4, 3 or 4. And so I was home by myself. And I remember having such a lovely childhood on Brinker. Mother was so cute with me, and she'd take me places and read to me and do all of these wonderful things. And I remember her reading me the story of Thumbelina. And we had like this beautiful bowl with water in it, and she'd put water lilies and flowers, and she'd float them in. And so when we read this story about that Hans Christian Andersen had written about Thumbelina, I could just picture Thumbelina on a lily pad floating, And Mother did things like that all the time. We had a very enriched childhood.
Because our bedrooms weren't very far away from theirs, I remember hearing them talk. They would talk a lot together. In the morning, when I would wake up, I could hear the sound of them talking, when they might still be in bed talking together.
Nobody went on planes. If anyone traveled, they went on trains. And I remember going with Mom to the depot, the Union Depot in Ogden, to see Dad off on a business trip. As a city recreation director, he would go on these business trips. And so there's one in Chicago, one in Miami, and places like that. Once Mother went with him. I think she went to Miami, one with him. And oh, that was really something, because we would cross all of these. Well, the Union Depot was beautiful, and it's been refurbished in Ogden now. It's well worth going to sometime. And we would go through that area with all of these crowds of people. And then we would go down these white steps, concrete steps, underground. And it was like, it was a basement. You were just sinking down, and it's like going in a subway. Mm-hmm. So we would go down in this white underground tunnel almost, and then we would find a little opening, a door, not a door, but an opening, and we'd go up the steps, and there we were on track 6 or track 7 or whatever, and there were the locomotives. And so, Dad would get on the train, we'd hug and kiss him goodbye, and what I remember that was so scary, these trains were huge, and the big yellow engines and the yellow cabooses and stuff, and they let off steam. And when they let off steam, oh, I remember being frightened out of my wits. They'd be whoosh. And the porters, it was interesting, the porters were all African American, and they were very dapper and very gentlemanly. And they would help people up the steps to the train, and they would serve you on the train, if you ate on the train. But what I remember was saying goodbye to Dad and being with Mother, and she had, my hand, holding onto my hand, so I was small. And I'm thinking Marcelly and Marianne may have been in school. Maybe Doug wasn't born, who knows?
The memory I have of my baptism is her braiding my hair, my wet hair after my baptism.
The war, Mother and Dad lived through the Depression, and they lived through the war. And when I was growing up, to me, World War II was quite a ways away. But boy, that wasn't true. It had only been over 1 year. And so there was 2 little girls next door, the Shiflets, and we used to swing back and forth in their swings. And I remember I'd swing as high as I could, and Sandy would swing next to me, and then we'd both jump out of the swings onto the grass, and we'd say, B-52 coming in for a landing, whoosh, and then we'd jump out on the grass. We thought that was so cool. Somehow we had heard about B-52s. We knew they were planes. And so the war influenced a lot of my growing up that I had no idea. Because to me the war was Vietnam. I mean, that was when I was in high school. But I remember hearing about World War II a lot, and I was fascinated by it. It just seemed to me that that was another century. That was years before, and that wasn't the case. And I remember I would go with Dad down to the mechanics or down to the gas station, and I'd tag along as he would buy certain things for the car or whatever. And I remember sometimes we'd go into places where there would be these big burly guys who were working, and they'd have these big tattoos. And they'd be tattoos that said Mom with an arrow in it, or there'd be half of a naked woman and they'd try to cover it up because there was a kid there, you know. And it was like the war had been over for a few years. They were embarrassed about their tattoos. But that was sort of unique in those days.
And I remember him telling me, I probably was 2 years old. I remember him setting me down once after he'd been carrying me somewhere, and he said, "You're getting too big for me to carry," and I just remember being crushed. It was like this sudden realization, I'm going to get too big for my dad to carry me, and I don't really want to get too big. He was a great dad.
Later, when I'd go to daddy-daughter dates with him and we'd have dances, I've never danced with anyone who danced like Dad. He was just so smooth and elegant and a fabulous, fabulous dancer. And I remember we'd come home from church, and she'd always put on the Longines Symphonette, which is Longines, Longines, and it was the symphony, and we'd listen to it every Sunday afternoon. We had an old Magnavox that was actually new then that Dad had scrimped and saved to buy, and it also had an old turntable in it, so we could play these 78 records, like the Stephen Foster records I talked about. And at night we'd flop on our stomachs and listen to radio programs, The Shadow, Armis Brooks, Horace and Dexter, or just funny things, you know, and we'd laugh and things. And I remember at Christmas time, we would listen to the Christmas Carol, you know, but I remember with The Shadow, you would hear, you know, the footsteps, you know, over the radio, and then you'd hear whistling. It's like, only the shadow knows what mystery lurks in the hearts of men. Only the shadow knows. So it was fun.
I remember we used to, what was the style then, is you would wear petticoats under your skirt, and you would starch these petticoats, and you'd starch them in sugar water so that they would stick out. And not only did they stick out, they rubbed against your legs, and you had red marks on your legs because of it. But I can remember them hanging down in the basement, and they would drip on the cement. But you'd get them just as stiff as you could, and then they'd stick out like that. And well, I think some of these wild styles, my mother probably disapproved, and I can remember kind of butting heads with her a few times.
I remember the first time that we went to the airport. It was the old airport in Salt Lake, and he wanted a prop plane, and I think he flew to Florida, and that was a big deal. This prop plane so well, and of course because you'd go right out on the tarmac, and you'd walk out on the tarmac, and then you'd go up the steps and into the plane. And actually my first plane ride back to San Francisco after Marianne was married, I did that. I walked out, and you know, and there was no security in those days. You could have someone drop you off at the airport and run with you through out the back door to the tarmac and get on the plane. If you could find a place to park in front, you'd just park in front, or you'd park wherever. You didn't have to walk very far. You'd go through the little terminal, and you'd go out on the back, and you'd go back on the tarmac, and you know, practically right up to the steps, and he could say goodbye and wave, and that was it. It was really interesting. I remember it was night when we went. I don't know why I remember it. And I remember it being night, and I remember the propellers.
The weekend that President Kennedy died, we rented a TV so we could watch that. Nobody thought that a president would ever be killed back then. I mean, it was, now everybody worries about the security of anybody, but not back then.
He did. He rented a TV
Yeah.
when Kennedy died. And I remember going from house to house with my friends, and every TV was on the same station. And it was all black and white. And it was just the caisson going down the street, and you could hear the horses' hooves clopping, and, you know, the riderless horse.
Then when President Kennedy died, Dad rented it for a week, feeling that we shouldn't miss that. And we all watched the funeral, but no one turned it on during the week. We were busy doing other things. And
I wanted to talk about Dad's hair. I remember him with dark curly hair, and I was 8 when he lost his hair. And so from the time I was born until I was about 8, I remember standing behind a blue overstuffed chair and combing his hair. And I'd run my fingers through it, and then I'd comb it, and then I'd part it, and then I'd do all these different things. And he was patient, he'd let me. And, you know, I'm so grateful, because that is a really sweet experience.
He lost his hair when I was 2 years old. I never knew him as anything but completely bald. And one of my happy memories of him was he would come home from work and sit down in his big stuffed leather chair and close his eyes, and I'd come up behind him and rub his head. And I think he really liked it. I don't know. He never commented, but he'd fall asleep with me rubbing his head, and it was kind of, I just felt really good that I could put my dad to sleep because I could rub his head, and he really liked it. I mean, it was kind of it was a fun bonding thing that I could rub his head and make him fall asleep. Yeah, when I was about 10, 11, 12, I was growing so fast that my legs would hurt. And she'd give me calcium and rub my legs.
I have very happy memories of traditions that we had. So one of the traditions was in the fall, we would basically clean up the clippings from the yard and the tree branches that we had, where we had pruned the trees. I'm just trying to think if we pruned the trees in the fall for the next year. But anyway, we'd build these huge bonfires, which were allowed by law. Now they probably wouldn't be allowed. And part of the fun of it was that we would go get potatoes from our mom and wrap them in tinfoil and bury them in the ashes of the fire. The fire was still going, but the places where we could find coals that were still warm or ashes that were still hot, we'd bury those potatoes, and in 20 minutes or so, take them out and open them up and put butter on them and eat baked potatoes right out of the fire. And it's a very vivid memory. I loved that memory.